On March 23, 2020, Valve released Half-Life Alyx, the game that, to this day, over 5 years later, is widely regarded as the definitive VR experience, with fluid combat, breathtaking visuals, and an insanely immersive and interactive world. Half-Life Alyx became the gold standard as to what a VR title should strive to become. Over 5 years ago. It's been half a decade, and nothing, not a single game, has come close to dethroning Alyx as the king of virtual reality interactive game experiences. So, why? Why is that? Well, to better understand the modern conundrum of VR, let's first take a look back at the history of the still somewhat infant medium of interactive entertainment.
Close your eyes, honey.
My name is Release Radar, and welcome to a casual retrospective on virtual reality. In July of 1982, a movie called Tron was released to theaters. This movie follows the character Kevin Flynn, a computer programmer who found himself injected into a virtual world. This transfer of self from reality to virtual reality was done by an AI known as the Master Control Program.
Hey! Look, if this is about those parking tickets, I can explain everything, okay?
In the virtual world that Flynn found himself in, computer programs are represented as virtual people, and those who use the computer are considered to be gods. Wishing for escape, Kevin finds himself teaming up with a security program called Tron. Together, Flynn and Tron fight in a series of deadly games. Games like Disc Fight or the iconic Light Cycle battles.
This is Blue Leader to Blue Bikes. Run these guys into your jet walls.
Copy, Blue Leader. Copy, Blue Leader. This is Gold 1 to Gold 2 and 3. Split up. Take them one-on-one.
And after a handful of these deadly games, Tron and Flynn eventually take on the MCP, the Master Control Program that got Flynn sucked into the virtual world at the start of the movie.
Users wrote us. The user even wrote you.
No one user wrote me. I'm worth millions of their man years.
By the end, they manage to come out on top, and Kevin escapes the program, returning to his normal daily life. While the virtual world of Tron isn't necessarily like VR as we know it today, Tron was one of the first films that introduced audiences to the concept of a virtual world, 42 years ago.
What kind of program is he?
He's not any kind of program, Sark. He's a user.
A user?
That's right. He pushed me in the real world. Somebody pushes me, I push back, so I brought him down here.
Audiences wouldn't have to wait long for another movie that depicted virtual reality. Brainstorm released only 1 year after Tron. While not nearly as influential as Tron, Brainstorm followed a team that developed a headset that records and plays back human experiences directly into another person's brain. However, the project spins out of control as the scientists begin to use it to explore near-death experiences and sexual encounters.
Sorry about that, ladies.
Eventually, Dr. Michael Brantz, one of the two leading scientists and developers of the headset, begins to lose his grasp on reality and fails to be able to grasp the lines between recorded memories and his own conscious self.
I'm finished.
While I personally find the concept of Brainstorm to be more captivating than that of Tron, unfortunately Brainstorm is more of just a cult classic as it performed significantly worse in the box office than Tron. However, about 9 years later, another movie that is culturally significant to the development of VR would release, The Lawnmower Man. This movie follows a scientist that uses VR to enhance the intelligence of a developmentally disabled man. And if you pay attention to what's on this guy in black's face, he's wearing the closest thing that we've seen so far to a modern virtual reality headset. Job Smith was a mentally impaired gardener who becomes the subject of an experiment led by Dr. Angelo. This experiment uses both drugs and virtual reality to enhance Job's intelligence.
All right?
Yeah.
Okay, just breathe now.
Too dark.
No, it's not going to be in a while. Just breathe and relax. That's it. In a while, it's going to be like being up there with the stars, Job. It's going to be like going to another planet.
As he gains more control over his cognitive abilities, he eventually gains extraordinary power both in the real world and the virtual realm. However, Job's transformation leads to dangerous consequences as he seeks to control the VR system for personal gain, ultimately becoming a powerful and detached entity. The film ends with a confrontation between Job and Dr. Angelo. After Angelo notices that Job's intelligence has grown to dangerous levels, he begins to attempt to shut down the digital system. However, Job is now a self-aware, autonomous entity and rejects his human limitations and ultimately gains control over the virtual world.
This technology is meant to expand human communication, but you're not even human anymore! What you've become terrifies me. You're a freak.
Your naive idiocy makes me very angry!
And I am too tired for this lawnmower man.
With the release of Tron in 1982, Brainstorm in 1983, and The Lawnmower Man in 1992, the world has now had 3 films to introduce them to the concept of virtual reality. However, game development beat the release of The Lawnmower Man by 1 year with the release of Virtuality in 1991.
Fly over Mars. Take a trek through a prehistoric jungle. Tour a house that has not yet been built. It's called virtual reality, and as Jay Schaefer found out, all it takes is a special helmet and a glove, and you're off.
Following the release and relative success of these 3 films, development began on a handful of different virtual reality titles. And in true late 1980s to early 1990s fashion, the first VR games to ever exist were arcade games.
Your only chance is to eliminate your opponents and be granted freedom. Your opponents are those joining you in the virtuality units around you. Seek and destroy. Jump from 10-story platforms. Rapid fire your lasers. Lock on missiles. And freedom is yours alone. But if you lose,
Terminated.
One of these VR arcade games was 1991's Dactyl Nightmare, a VR first-person shooter with checkerboard arenas and familiar game modes such as Capture the Flag. This early virtual reality game ran on Amiga 3000 Commodore systems, which had a Motorola 6830 processor at either 16 MHz or 25 MHz, 2 megabytes of RAM, and cost the equivalent of roughly $8,000 today.
As with most VR systems, Waldron's uses stereoscopic images projected onto tiny screens inside the viewer's helmet. A powerful computer then generates the graphics and sounds needed to convince the viewer he's in another world.
Yet, surprisingly, these basic computers were able to output VR games at around 30 frames per second and even allowed for multiplayer experiences.
Linked by a computer that tracks our individual motions, Waldron and I are now both inside the same electronic world.
There you are. Hi. Hello there.
Returning to the game in question, Dactyl Nightmare, the game puts 4 players against each other with standard VR FPS gameplay, guns, and physical movement and aiming.
I've got a joystick. I've got a helmet.
That's right, and you just put the helmet on like that.
Right.
And of course you see that you have a gun in your hand, and to fire the gun, you simply press the trigger. And I'll get in and join you.
Okay.
However, there's a pterodactyl that flies around the arena that randomly snatches players from the ground. While there isn't much footage of this game, graphics, as you can see on screen, are extremely rudimentary, but regardless of how dated the game looks and feels, this game was extraordinarily revolutionary for its time, and allowed arcadegoers to not only experience VR, but play with their friends in a multiplayer environment 33 years ago.
Pterodactyl at this point. Oh, here comes the bird. Where's that bird? He's got you. He's got you, guy. Ah, he got me from behind. Oh, my God. I think I have to take this helmet off. I'm physically feeling the space here for a second.
But revolutionary tech doesn't always mean success. So how popular was Dactyl Nightmare in the 90s? Well, Dactyl Nightmare was considered to be a novelty hit in the early 90s, rather than an arcade success like Pac-Man. And while it's difficult to pin down the exact number of Virtuality's 1000 series headsets that had Dactyl Nightmare installed on them, we can assume that the game was playable at a few hundred arcades across the United States, and were often found in cyberzone sections of malls and theme parks or VR-specific arcades. It's possible that high installation fees, around $60,000 to $75,000 per multiplayer setup in the 90s, and additional maintenance costs for operators prevented them from wanting to put Virtuality 1000 series headsets in their arcades. Yet, despite the limited number of headsets with Dactyl Nightmare installed, the game is fondly remembered by people who got the opportunity to play it in the early 90s, and has even had somewhat of a remake available on the Quest Store.
You can just basically try this for free on the Oculus Store, and it's called Polygon Nightmare.
Yet, Dactyl Nightmare was not the only VR title that released in the early 90s. In fact, a year before it hit the scene, a fantasy-themed VR adventure called Legend Quest debuted in 1990. Yet, sadly, no gameplay footage has surfaced of Legend Quest VR. However, I was able to find a fully detailed write-up on the game on arcadehistory.com. Quote, "It was a full-on dungeon crawler. Players strapped on a VR headset and picked up a staff or a sword-shaped controller and made their way through a medieval world filled with monsters, puzzles, and treasure. Legend Quest, compared to the fast 3-minute deathmatches of Dactyl Nightmare, was a more story-driven experience, more of an adventure game than a traditional arcade game. It almost seems like Legend Quest VR was inspired by the likes of Dungeons & Dragons, a tabletop adventure game that came out about 16 years before Legend Quest VR. Surprisingly, there was even some diversity in titles offered in virtual reality in the 1990s. While Legend Quest and Dactyl Nightmare were both traditional stand-up, room-scale environments, there were even cockpit simulators offered, like VTOL VR. Well, not VTOL VR, but VTOL, a game in VR.
This machine promises to fly me through a virtually real environment, as if I was in a vertical takeoff jet. Like before, the helmet allows me to survey the scene.
However, much like with Legend Quest VR, footage of VTOL VR is very limited, and the footage that you're seeing on screen right now is all I could find. Yet from this footage, we can discern that the game allowed for simple co-op flight with massive VR control units with joysticks to mimic the experience of actually flying a plane.
Where have you gone now? Oh, and away you go, right, fine. I better try and catch up with you then.
Where are you, Howard?
I'm still over the land, yes. I'm having a bit of trouble finding you.
Off I go, over the mountains.
I'm going over the sea now.
Yes, I'm just in sight of the sea myself.
But regardless of the lack of footage, it was a surprise to nobody that virtual reality was really taking off. And while it sadly was pretty difficult to find an arcade near you in the 90s that offered VR game experiences, popular gaming companies were watching the development and growing interest of VR quite closely. Following the success of the virtual reality arcade, development began on a handful of in-home VR systems, the first of which would debut in 1993. This headset was the VictorMax Stuntmaster. The Stuntmaster featured a single LCD screen inside of the visor and used a system of mirrors to create the illusion of depth. It offered head tracking, letting players tilt and turn their head to shift the perspective on screen. But it wasn't true VR as we think of it today. At launch, this headset sold for around $179. Yet, despite its futuristic look, the headset was heavy, uncomfortable, and had a very low resolution, leading to eye strain and headaches for many players. Additionally, the Stuntmaster didn't even have its own exclusive game library. Instead, it was basically a head-mounted display that plugged into existing consoles, like the Sega Genesis or SNES. Some of the supported titles included LHX Attack Chopper, F-22 Interceptor, Steel Talons, and Red Baron. This device launched at the aforementioned price of $179 in 1993, roughly $380 in today's money, and was hyped up for being a very affordable VR headset, but sadly, it did not sell well. Poor sales could be attributed to the fact that this was a very basic VR headset even for its time in 1993. However, virtual reality enthusiasts wouldn't have to wait long for another headset to launch from the same company. This headset was the VictorMax CyberMax and was pretty ambitious for its time. But regardless of how ambitious the headset was, technology was just really not where it needed to be for virtual reality, as each eye only had a resolution of about 263 by 230. The field of view was also pretty low by today's standards at about 30 to 35 degrees, which is extremely narrow tunnel vision like field of view. The headset also supported very basic head tracking, came with built-in stereo speakers, and weighed about 1.2 pounds, and came out at a price of about $699 in 1993, which is about $1,500 today. Surprisingly, the CyberMax did not have its own exclusive game library. Instead, it piggybacked off of existing titles and offered virtual reality support using its headset's features. However, there was only a small number of VR titles officially supported for the CyberMax VR system, approximately 10 to 15 games in total. The most popular games offered on the CyberMax VR headset officially were Magic Carpet, developed by Bullfrog, Descent by Interplay, SEAL Team 6 Delta Force by Electronic Arts, and Dactyl Nightmare Classic by Virtuality. Yet, the most sought-after game to play on this VR headset was not even an official release. It was a mod for Doom published by id Software that allows you to play Doom in virtual reality in 1993. Doom really does just run on anything. Yet with the extremely limited number of officially supported titles and the small handful of modded experiences, it's no surprise that the CyberMax was a commercial flop. The headset vastly underperformed compared to the hype surrounding it, and it seemed as if virtual reality was still just a dream for in-home users. However, it wouldn't take long for more competition to enter the in-home VR scene. With the release of the Forte VFX-1 in 1994, only 1 year after the CyberMax. This headset had a near identical resolution to that of the CyberMax, but had a 10-degree wider field of view, better quality audio, and a built-in microphone. One of the biggest differences about the VFX-1 compared to the CyberMax is that the VFX-1 actually came with controllers that the user could use as input in virtual reality. Altogether, the base package of the VFX-1 included the headset itself, head tracking sensors, the Cyberpunk 3-button handheld controller, VIP interface board, and whatever drivers and software utilities needed. All of this came with a hefty price of about $995 in 1994, which translates to about $2,000 today in 2025. But unfortunately, the VFX-1 fell victim to the same problem that the CyberMax did with an extremely limited selection of games, all of which were just officially supported ports of pre-existing games, and just like the CyberMax, the VFX-1 was a commercial flop. Yet, once again, virtual reality enthusiasts would only have to wait about 1 year for the next headset to be announced. And this time, a headset was going to be announced by a well-known and well-respected industry behemoth, Nintendo. And in 1995, the world would finally meet the now infamous Virtual Boy. Right off the bat, one of the most puzzling decisions made by Nintendo for the Virtual Boy was the inclusion of a red and black only monochrome LED display. This decision was extremely confusing for customers considering the fact that both the CyberMax VR headset and the Forte VFX-1 had 256 color 8-bit displays. Furthermore, there's several reports that users even got severe eye strain or just general pain in their eyes just from using the Virtual Boy due to the monochrome red and black color display. However, the biggest sin of the Nintendo Virtual Boy was the fact that it was really not a virtual reality headset due to the fact that it lacked any kind of head tracking or positional tracking. Unlike the CyberMax or the VFX-1, the Nintendo Virtual Boy did not have stereoscopic head movements in a 3D space. Rather, it was stereoscopic 3D only, and, once again, on a harsh red and black display. So to reiterate, Nintendo, one of the biggest gaming companies in the world, came out with a fake virtual reality headset that was marketed as a true VR headset that offered no motion tracking, no visual immersion, and was basically just a device that you looked through to play simple games. Due to all of this, And regardless of the fact that it outsold both the Cybermax and the VFX-1, the Nintendo Virtual Boy was a commercial flop just like the aforementioned headsets. Needless to say, after the flop of 4 consumer-grade headsets, the gaming industry as a whole and customers were ready to move away from virtual reality and back to traditional flat-screen gaming. While it might be difficult to imagine in 2025, gaming used to be an incredibly niche hobby. Most people were aware of early consoles like the Sega Saturn or the Nintendo 64, but those systems did not sell that many units compared to that of the PlayStation 4 or even the Nintendo Wii. Gaming simply just wasn't mainstream. Casual players would go to arcades to get their fix, but the vast majority of people didn't own home gaming consoles, whether it be for the lack of interest or overall cost. However, on March 4th, 2000, Sony would launch the PlayStation 2, the successor to the moderately successful PlayStation, and it would quickly become one of the best-selling consoles of all time. When the PS2 launched, home consoles had already been around for a few decades, and some even saw moderate success, like the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, better known as the SNES, and the Atari 2600. These consoles sold each 49 million units and 30 million units respectively. However, by the end of its lifespan, the Sony PlayStation 2 managed to sell a staggering 155 million units total, which is way more than the combined sales of the SNES and the Atari 2600. In fact, the PlayStation 2 outsold the SNES by about 3 times and the Atari 2600 by more than 5 times. Needless to say, the PlayStation 2 was a massive success, and the success could be attributed to its over 4,000 officially released titles across all regions over its 13-year lifespan as a console. Massive franchises like Grand Theft Auto made a name for themselves on the PlayStation 2 through titles like Grand Theft Auto 3, Grand Theft Auto Vice City, and Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Additionally, other notable games like God of War 1 and 2, Shadow of the Colossus, and the Devil May Cry series got their start on the Sony PlayStation 2. There was honestly an insane variety of games offered for the time, with action-adventure games like the aforementioned GTA series, RPGs like Persona, racing games like Gran Turismo, fighting games like Tekken and Mortal Kombat, and even sports series like FIFA, Madden NFL, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. There were even some early horror hits offered like Silent Hill 2 and 3. Additionally, one of my earliest gaming memories ever was playing a game on the PS2 called Thrillville, and I'm sure a lot of you watching this video have early memories of playing on the PlayStation 2 as well. Furthermore, one of the biggest selling points of the PlayStation 2 was the fact that you could use it as a gaming console and a DVD player, which was a major reason why people bought it early on. This was because in early 2000, most standalone DVD players sold for about $400 to $1,000 US, while the PlayStation 2 sold for about $299, which is about $540 today. So with a competitive price, the fact that it could also play DVDs, and a very wide selection of games, it's no surprise that the Sony PlayStation 2 saw the success that it did. It wouldn't take long following the release of the PlayStation 2 for a new player to enter the ring of home consoles. Microsoft stepped in on November 15th, 2001, releasing the Xbox. However, Microsoft had a massive uphill battle to fight trying to entice gamers to purchase an Xbox over the PS2, which had already made a name for itself. So, what was Microsoft's strategy? How was the Xbox different from the PlayStation 2? Well, on the hardware side, the Microsoft Xbox was just more powerful. It was built like a PC, had an Intel Pentium 3 CPU, NVIDIA GPU, and crucially, a built-in hard drive which the PS2 did not have. Meaning to save on the PS2, you needed memory cards. However, on the Xbox, you could save locally onto the device. Games not only looked better, but also ran better on the Xbox compared to the PS2, and the Xbox even had some more revolutionary titles like Halo, Splinter Cell, Halo 2, and The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. While the PlayStation 2 had more games overall than the Xbox just had genre-defining hits like the original Halo Combat Evolved. And one thing that Microsoft just happened to do much better than Sony at the time was online play, with Xbox Live, which launched in 2002. With how widespread online gaming is today, it's hard to imagine what it was like in the early 2000s when multiplayer gaming was primarily done on PC. Yet, Microsoft's Xbox Live aimed to unite console gamers in a similar vein, and Xbox Live became one of the first unified and seamless online services available for console players. Yet, regardless of all of those benefits that the Xbox had over the PlayStation 2, the PS2 outsold the Xbox 6-1. With the Xbox only selling about 24 million units worldwide. And pricing was not a factor here, as the Xbox launched at the same price of $299, roughly $540 today. Yet, regardless of the poor performance of the Xbox relative to that of the PlayStation 2, Microsoft was here to stay in the console game, and only 4 years after the release of the original Xbox, Microsoft would release the Xbox 360. This time, the tables turned a little bit, with the Xbox 360 launching about a full year before the PlayStation 3 did, at a price of about $399 US. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $638 today. This time, Microsoft went all in on online gaming, offering Xbox Live on the Xbox 360 from day one. Launch titles for the Xbox 360 included Ridge Racer 7, Call of Duty 3, Resistance Fall of Man, and Genji Days of the Blade. And throughout the Xbox 360's lifespan, it would see massive hits with core features built around the device's connectivity, like Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, Halo 3, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Halo Reach, Minecraft, and much, much more. By the time Sony eventually released the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360 had already been in consumers' homes for a year, so the PlayStation 3 this time had the uphill battle to fight. However, PlayStation set itself apart by not charging gamers an annual fee for online connectivity, unlike Xbox Live. But the PlayStation 3 managed to shoot itself in the foot with its pricing at launch. The 20GB model launched at $500, which is about $778 today, and the more premium 60GB model launched at $600, which is about $934 today. Due to the fact that the Xbox 360 released 1 year prior, and the fact that the PlayStation 3 was overall a more expensive console, the PS3 had a very slow start. Yet that all changed around the 2010s when Sony decided to pivot away from mimicking the Xbox 360's experience and instead create their own massive in-home blockbuster hits, making Sony games genre-defining classics that you must own a PlayStation to play. This decision is the one that led PlayStation to its place in the gaming space today, the console to own for the biggest games of the year. And with the onslaught of genre-defining, record-breaking games only available on PlayStation 3, the PS3 managed to crawl its way to the top, outselling the Xbox 360 narrowly by only a few million units, with the 360 selling about 84 million units worldwide, and the PS3 selling about 88 million units worldwide. However, if you've been paying attention to this section of the video, you'll notice that there's a specific company that I haven't really spoken about that much. That company being Nintendo. And well, that's because Nintendo was up to their own thing with the Wii and the creation of the motion control craze. On November 19th, 2006, the Nintendo Wii would release, becoming one of the most popular gaming devices for casual gamers worldwide. This was likely due to the focus on motion controls, allowing individuals who don't game often to easily play almost every title available on the Wii. The console even came included with one of its most popular games, Wii Sports, which was so fun and intuitive to play that anyone from a teenager to your grandparents could learn the motion controls. I even have vivid memories of my whole family gathered around the TV playing Wii Bowling, Wii Boxing, Wii Tennis, and almost every other minigame included in both Wii Sports and Wii Sports Resort. And I'm sure a lot of you watching have similar memories as well. So how did the motion controls work? Well, the system used a combination of motion sensing inside the Wii remote and an infrared IR sensor bar placed near the TV. The remote contained accelerometers to detect movement and tilt, while the IR sensor bar helped the Wii track positioning by reading signals from the remote's front-facing IR camera. Later, the Wii Motion Plus accessory added a gyroscope for precise one-to-one motion tracking. The controllers came with an included wrist strap that users were incentivized to wear to avoid tossing their remotes at TVs or at their friends and family. Yet, user error did occur quite a few times. And while the Wii was traditionally busy focusing on family fun and motion-controlled games, Nintendo did attempt to somewhat mimic the experience of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 with a small handful of Call of Duty games available on the platform. These titles were mostly trimmed-down ports and included games like Call of Duty 3, Call of Duty World at War, Call of Duty Modern Warfare Reflex Edition,
50,000 people used to live here. Now it's a ghost town.
Call of Duty Black Ops, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. However, these titles vastly underperformed on the Wii compared to their 360 and PS3 counterparts. This could possibly be attributed to how common the Wii was in non-gaming households and how lackluster Nintendo's online gaming service was. Yet, regardless of the poor performance of some of gaming's biggest hits on the Wii got so popular that it had a dedicated episode on South Park and sold roughly 101 million units worldwide, becoming one of the most popular gaming consoles of all time. Furthermore, the success of the Wii could also be attributed to some of its blockbuster games, like the aforementioned Wii Sports and Wii Sports Resort, Mario Kart Wii, Wii Fit, Rock Band, Guitar Hero, and Super Smash Bros. Brawl. However, the motion control experience just wasn't perfect. Having to use the Wii Remote and sometimes the additional joystick nunchuck was clunky. So what if you could play games without a remote at all? Well, the successful concept of motion controls did not go unnoticed by Microsoft, and they would attempt just that. At E3 2009, Microsoft would tease Project Natal. The concept was to remove the barrier of a controller, making your body the controller itself. The demo teased a lot of revolutionary features, and gamers wouldn't have to wait long to test it out for themselves in their homes. Microsoft would release the Kinect on November 4th, 2010. The Kinect was Microsoft's motion sensing camera for the Xbox 360, designed to let players control games using their whole body, no controller required. It used an RGB camera, an infrared depth sensor, and a multi-array microphone to track body movements, gestures, and voice commands in real time. This device retailed at $149.99 as a standalone device, or bundled with a brand new Xbox 360 Slim, which was a mid-generation refresh of the Xbox 360 following the dreaded Red Ring of Death. Hype for the Kinect was real, and it sold 8 million units in its first 60 days after launch. And the Guinness Book of World Records even recognized it as the fastest-selling consumer electronic device in history at the time. The Kinect launched with a pack-in game called Kinect Adventures, which showcased minigames like river rafting and obstacle courses. And eventually, Microsoft would release Kinect Sports, their answer and competitor to Wii Sports. Some of the most popular and best-selling games on the Kinect were Kinect Sports, Dance Central, the Just Dance series, Kinect Disneyland Adventures, Kinect Party, and the notorious and meme-worthy Kinect Star Wars, which offered the hilarious Galaxy Dance-Off. And by early 2013, Microsoft had sold over 24 million Kinect units. Yet, despite its record-breaking launch, the Kinect struggled with long-term adoption. This could be due to the tracking accuracy being inconsistent, especially in small or poorly lit rooms. And there's also the fact that the Xbox 360 was more of a dude bro hardcore shooter kind of console, and most games that came out on the Kinect were just not that. This was because Microsoft was attempting to mimic the success of the Nintendo Wii, and most Kinect games that launched as a result were more casual or family-friendly experiences, with very few hardcore titles offered, which is what most traditional Xbox 360 gamers would want. And as a result, overall interest in the Kinect would slowly start to decline. However, Microsoft would attempt to revive the concept of the Kinect with the Xbox One, their third console, bundling it with every single unit at launch. However, backlash over its mandatory inclusion and limited game support led to Microsoft unbundling the Kinect in 2014. Effectively ending its momentum. Microsoft effectively tried and failed to mimic the experience of the Wii with the Kinect. However, they weren't the only ones who attempted. Sony also tried to mimic the experience of the Wii with the PlayStation Move. Just like the Microsoft Xbox Kinect, the PlayStation Move was announced at E3 2009 and officially launched in September of 2010 for the PlayStation 3. Sony, just like Microsoft, developed the Move as a direct response to the Wii's success, emphasizing precision motion controls with the accuracy of the PlayStation Eye camera. And unlike the Kinect, but more like the Wii, the PlayStation Move did come with controllers. The Move system used a wand-like controller with a glowing orb on top, tracked by the PlayStation Eye camera, along with built-in accelerometers and gyroscopes for motion. The Move even had a secondary navigation controller, like a one-handed gamepad, for analog stick input in certain games. The orb on the Move controller changed color so the camera could track depth and position in 3D space. Combined with motion sensors inside the controller, it was more precise than the Wii remote, without needing a sensor bar, and it even offered rumble feedback and additional face buttons for hybrid control. The Move essentially tried to merge motion gaming with traditional controller-based console gaming. And much like the Xbox 360 Kinect, the PlayStation Move launched with its own Wii Sports competitor called Sports Champions. Furthermore, some of the most popular titles for the PlayStation Move were Sports Champion and Sports Champions 2, the Just Dance series, Little Big Planet 2, and Heavy Rain Move Edition. Overall, the PlayStation Move worked very well technically, with accuracy often praised as better than the Kinect and the Wii. However, its library leaned heavily on casual sports and party games, with only a few core titles supporting it. Sales of the PlayStation Move were decent. Sony managed to ship about 15 million units by 2012, but it never became a true system seller. By the early 2010s, motion controls had become a major experiment across all three console giants. Nintendo had proven just how massive the market could be with the Wii. Microsoft tried to take it a step further with the Kinect's controller-free gameplay, and Sony offered a more precise but optional approach with the PlayStation Move. But as the novelty wore off, gamers started asking a new question: what's next? And well, that's where a small Kickstarter campaign in 2012 changed everything. While gaming in the new millennium was becoming one of the world's largest entertainment industries, virtual reality quietly slipped into the background. After the disastrous launches of several headsets in the 1990s, consumer-grade VR was dismissed as little more than a failed experiment. But by the 2010s, technology had advanced far beyond what the 90s could offer. Faster processors, sharper displays, and improvement in motion tracking set the stage for VR's redemption. That point of redemption came in 2012 when a young engineer named Palmer Luckey launched a Kickstarter campaign for the Oculus DK1. This project captivated both developers and consumers, reigniting the dream of virtual reality once again. This Kickstarter went live on August 1st, 2012. The goal? Just $250,000 to fund the creation of the first development kits. These kits were just simple prototypes, just to prove that virtual reality could work this time. So how long did it take Palmer to raise that $250,000? A couple weeks? A month? A year? No, only 4 hours. In just 4 hours, the project hit its target. And within 36 hours, pledges soared past $1 million, proving that the dream of virtual reality was very much still alive. For just $300, backers could secure their very own developer kit. It wasn't a perfect headset, it was a prototype. Its screen resolution was low, its image was blurry, and motion blur was a constant reminder that this was still the beginning. But for the first time in decades, players and developers alike felt that VR was real, and it was within reach this time. By the end, the Kickstarter managed to raise over $2.4 million, nearly 10 times their goal, and by March of 2013, Oculus began shipping out the DK1. By May of the same year, more than 3,700 units had gone out, with production ramping to over 1,200 units a week. Kickstarter backers from around the globe unboxed their headsets and began experimenting, modding, and creating the very first wave of VR content. This is when I was introduced to the concept of virtual reality, watching PewDiePie play a bunch of games in 2013, 2014 with the Oculus DK1. The videos that content creators like PewDiePie, Jacksepticeye, and Markiplier would post on YouTube got millions, if not tens of millions of views, and well, the spark of virtual reality had finally caught fire. When the Oculus Rift DK1 began to ship to Kickstarter backers in 2013, as I said, it was far from perfect. It used a single 7-inch LCD screen split between both eyes at a resolution of just 640 by 800 per eye. The refresh rate topped out at 60 Hz, and the low resolution created a visible screen door effect across the image. Tracking was limited to rotation only, yaw, pitch, and roll. You could look around, but you couldn't lean forward like you could with later headsets like the Quest 2. Furthermore, the headset offered a field of view of about 90 degrees and even allowed for swappable lenses for people with different eyesights. But this headset really was just the beginning for Oculus. And nearly 4 years after the original Kickstarter, in January of 2016, Oculus made an announcement that nobody expected. They announced that every original Kickstarter backer, regardless of their pledge, would receive the final consumer Rift headset for free. This was a move made to show the world that virtual reality is here and it's finally real. On the 6th of January 2016, pre-orders for the Oculus Rift CV1 finally opened, and by March of the same year, shipments began, delivering the first polished consumer-ready VR headset of the modern era. However, during all of this, other companies were in the background, slowly watching the overnight success of Oculus. And 1 year before the next wave of Oculus headsets would release, both HTC and Sony would end up announcing their own devices in the same month. The HTC Vive, revealed in March of 2015 in partnership with Valve, was a true rival to the Rift. Like Oculus, it was designed for PC VR, but it introduced a groundbreaking feature with room-scale tracking. Using a system of lighthouse base stations, the Vive allowed players to walk around and interact inside a mapped physical space. No longer confined to a chair, users could lean, dodge, and explore, turning VR from a stationary experience into a truly physical one. The Vive's controllers, which shipped in the box, were built from the ground up for motion. Each wand featured precise tracking sensors, a trackpad, triggers, and haptic feedback, giving developers the tools to build immersive experiences that went beyond gamepads. When the Vive finally launched in April of 2016, it was priced at $799, a premium cost compared to the Rift, but it came bundled in the box with controllers and base stations. And out of the box, the Vive offered the most complete VR package of its generation. The HTC Vive used dual 3.6-inch Pentile OLED screens with a resolution of 2160 by 1200 or 1080 by 1200 per eye. It had a refresh rate of 90 Hz and a field of view of 110 degrees. Unfortunately, there are no exact sales figures to track down for the HTC Vive. However, in early November 2016, HTC did confirm that they have sold much more than 140,000 units, and that each headset was sold at a profit. Yet, while HTC and Oculus were competing for the PC enthusiast VR market, Sony took an entirely different path. Also revealed in March of 2015, under the codename Project Morpheus, PlayStation VR promised to bring virtual reality to the masses. And instead of requiring a high-end gaming PC, it was built to run on the already popular PlayStation 4. When the PSVR headset launched in October of 2016, it arrived at a low price of $399, half the cost of the Vive, and cheaper than the Rift once you factor in controllers and sensors. But it did require a $300 console to run. Yet, by using the existing PlayStation camera and repurposed PlayStation Move controllers, Sony lowered the barrier to entry and immediately had access to a massive built-in audience of console gamers. The headset itself featured a unique halo strap design that made it more comfortable for long sessions. And while its tracking was not as advanced as the Vive's Lighthouse systems, it delivered impressive VR experiences at a price point that no one else could match. The headset used a 5.7-inch OLED display at a resolution of 1920 by 1080, or 960 by 1080 per eye. Furthermore, the headset had a native 90 Hz refresh rate, or it could be motion interpolated to 120 Hz. and the headset offered a field of view of approximately 100 degrees. By the end of its life cycle, the PlayStation VR headset managed to sell over 5 million units, making it the best-selling headset of its era, outselling both the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive by a lot. Overall, these headsets combined sold an estimated 5,315,000 units and finally showed the world that virtual reality wasn't just a dream, it's a reality. And this was just the beginning. About 1 year prior to the HTC Vive and PSVR reveal events, something huge happened in the VR scene. On March 25th, 2014, Facebook, now Meta, acquired Oculus for an insanely large sum of $2 billion. Founder and engineer Palmer Luckey and the CEO Brendan Iribe decided to stay in leadership roles, and Facebook claimed that this investment would allow VR to grow beyond just simply gaming. However, Facebook's dreams weren't quite on the horizon yet. In the meantime, Oculus would use this new funding to further develop iterations of VR technology, and the first major result of this partnership came in 2016 with the release of the Oculus Rift. This headset was the company's first true consumer VR headset and launched into a competitive landscape alongside the HTC Vive and PSVR. The Rift itself was a technically impressive device for its time. It featured dual OLED displays with a combined resolution of 2160 by 1200 or 1080 by 1200 per eye, running at 90 Hz, which allowed for smoother motion compared to earlier prototypes like the DK1. This headset also offered a 110-degree field of view and integrated positional tracking through an external infrared sensor. At launch, the Rift was bundled with an Xbox One controller and later received its iconic Oculus Touch controllers, which introduced natural hand presence and greatly improved immersion in VR. However, commercially, the Rift struggled to dominate the market due to stiff competition from the HTC Vive and later the PlayStation VR, which were both compelling alternatives. By 2018, estimates suggested that the Rift had sold between 500,000 and 1 million units worldwide, trailing behind the PlayStation VR's stronger console-based adoption. Critically, however, the Rift was well received for its visual clarity, comfort, and pioneering motion controls once the touch controllers arrived. Yet regardless of this awesome technology, reviewers frequently cited the high price point as a barrier to entry for consumers. This was because, at launch, the Rift itself was $599, not including the cost of a capable gaming PC or the later released VR Touch controllers. Even so, the Rift is remembered as one of the key headsets that legitimized modern VR, setting the stage for Facebook's long-term ambitions in the industry. However, regardless of the success of his dreams, Palmer Luckey stepped away from Oculus in 2017 under controversial circumstances, and the former CEO was soon to follow. Reportedly, these departures were due to disagreements over Facebook's push towards cheaper standalone headsets, rather than the high-end PC VR headsets that Oculus was originally known for. However, that shift in focus defined the next era of virtual reality for Oculus. And in 2018, Oculus announced the Oculus Go, the first standalone VR headset, priced at just $199. The Oculus Go was lightweight and simple, designed more for media consumption rather than gaming. This headset ran on a Qualcomm Snapdragon 821 processor with a single fast-switch LCD display at 2560 by 1440 resolution, offering about 538 pixels per inch. However, the Go was limited to 3 degrees of freedom tracking, meaning you could look around but not move freely in space. Critics praised its affordability, built-in audio, and solid design, calling it VR for the masses, but its limited tracking and content library made it feel like more of a proof of concept than a true revolutionary device. Sales started modestly, reaching roughly 250,000 units by late 2018 and passing 2 million by mid-2019. While many users quickly set it aside, the Go proved that standalone VR was viable and set the stage for what came next. In 2019, Oculus followed up the Oculus Go with the Oculus Quest. Powered by a Snapdragon 835 chip, it featured dual OLED displays at 1440 by 1600 per eye, running at 72 Hz, and most importantly, inside-out tracking with 4 built-in cameras. Unlike the Go, the Quest offered 6 degrees of freedom, letting players walk, duck, and move naturally in a room without external sensors or wires. It also came bundled with redesigned touch controllers that delivered intuitive, hand-like input. For many, this was the first VR headset that truly captured the magic of virtual reality. And alongside the launch of the Oculus Quest came the Rift S, a revision of the original Rift built in partnership with Lenovo. The Rift S used a single LCD display at 2560 by 1440 with inside-out tracking and dropped the need for external sensors. But while the Rift S streamlined PC VR, it was overshadowed by the freedom of the Quest, which clearly was Oculus's real focus for the future. And that future came quickly, with Oculus launching the Quest 2 in October of 2020. At just $299, the Quest 2 packed a Snapdragon XR2 processor, 6GB of RAM, and an upgraded LCD panel at 1832 by 1920 per eye. This headset launched with a refresh rate of 72 Hz, but later with software upgrades would be upgraded to 90 Hz and even 120 Hz throughout the years. The Quest 2 was lighter, sharper, and more powerful than its predecessors, and by late 2021, Qualcomm confirmed that over 10 million units had shipped, and later reports put the number well past 20 million, making it the best-selling VR headset ever made. The Quest 2 became virtual reality's true first mainstream success story, but there was controversy, as Facebook required users to log in with their social media accounts, sparking backlash from longtime supporters who had been there since the Kickstarter days, before logging into Facebook accounts was required to use the headsets. However, this minor controversy would not keep Meta from innovating in the VR scene. Facebook, the now owners of Oculus, were no strangers to controversy at the time. They even rebranded from Facebook to Meta while undergoing constant public backlash due to privacy concerns, which also happened to be during the development of the metaverse, a failed virtual life experiment. Finally, in 2023, Meta launched the Quest 3 at $499. Powered by a Snapdragon XR2 Generation 2, it included 8GB of RAM, dual LCD panels at 2064 by 2208 per eye, running up to 120 Hz, and pancake lenses that made it slimmer and more comfortable to wear. The main focus of the Quest 3 was mixed reality, with full color pass-through allowing players to blend the real world and virtual world seamlessly. Critics praised its slimmer design, sharper image quality, and huge performance boost over the Quest 2, but also noted that mixed reality felt more like a preview than a full feature. Sales of the Quest 3 were solid, with over 1 million units sold in the US by late 2024, but adoption lagged behind the explosive success of the Quest 2, which could possibly be attributed to the fact that everyone was stuck at home during the Quest 2's release. However, these low sale figures of the Quest 3 showed that Meta's VR hardware no longer carried the same momentum. And well, I have a strong theory as to why that is, and we'll get to that. But before we do, we should take a look at the software provided for virtual reality users, as these games were just as important to VR's growth as the headsets themselves were. There are two main types of virtual reality games: exclusive VR titles that are built from the ground up to truly immerse the player, and ports of pre-existing popular titles that have been out for years. Obviously, when virtual reality was first launched, there was a lot of gimmicky, short experiences that I wouldn't even consider to be full games. This was because virtual reality was still pretty new in the early 2010s, and a lot of game developers didn't want to go full on in and greenlight production of massive AAA VR games. So instead, a lot of studios decided to take their popular titles and inject virtual reality controls and camera movement into them, creating a massive wave of VR ports in the mid-2010s. One of the best examples of this is Bethesda's Elder Scrolls V Skyrim Virtual Reality Edition. Personally, this is one of my favorite PC VR games today, yet that was not always the case. In fact, Skyrim VR initially launched as a PlayStation VR exclusive title, abandoning the already underserved PC VR community. Furthermore, the game was, in true BGS fashion, a bit of a broken and clunky experience. The title struggled with dated visuals, with extremely bad pop-in, as well as awkward controls. The game even had performance issues on PlayStation VR, which is a bit jarring considering Skyrim originally launched on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in 2011. 6 years before the PlayStation VR port. However, regardless of these issues, players were simply impressed that a full-scale RPG the size of Skyrim was even possible to play in virtual reality. But the buggy experience did land the game a mixed reception for PlayStation VR users. Only 1 year after the exclusive PlayStation VR launch, Skyrim VR would launch on Steam and was finally playable via PC VR. Unfortunately, however, the port to PC really was just a port, and the PC version had the same issues that the PSVR version did. No player body, horrible pop-in, poor controls, and dated visuals. However, if you know anything about the Bethesda PC community, you wouldn't be surprised to learn that mods began to flood the Nexus Mod Manager page to fix nearly all issues players had with Skyrim VR. And the craziest part is, with the right mods, Skyrim VR turns from a very lackluster VR experience into one of the most content-complete and best overall virtual reality games to this day. Yet, other ports wouldn't be so lucky. Borderlands 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. Between the Xbox 360, PS4, and PC, I have well over 500 hours in that title, and like many others, I believe that it might be the best game in this series. Needless to say, I was very hyped when I heard that Borderlands 2 was getting a virtual reality port. Funny enough, Borderlands 2 VR has a very similar beginning to Skyrim VR, as the game also launched initially as a PlayStation VR exclusive in December of 2018. The game was praised for how good the cel-shaded art style looked in virtual reality, and for how smooth the gunplay felt. But there were many more negatives to this VR port than positives. For some reason, Gearbox decided to launch Borderlands 2 VR without co-op, one of the defining traits of the Borderlands series. It's even more jarring considering the fact that most of the marketing material for the upcoming Borderlands 4 puts co-op gameplay as a main pillar of the Borderlands experience. Yet for some odd reason, co-op gameplay was completely removed from the Borderlands 2 VR port, a port that came out 6 years after the original release of Borderlands 2 in 2012. Furthermore, there were other weird decisions made for the virtual reality experience of Borderlands 2, like scopes not actually being see-through, creating a box pop-up whenever you aim down sights on specific weapons like sniper rifles. And there was also no manual reloading available, a feature that's commonplace in almost every VR first-person shooter. However, it is excusable considering the amount of guns that are in every Borderlands game. And after 1 year of PlayStation VR exclusivity, Borderlands 2 VR eventually came to PC when I finally picked up the game. All of the previously listed issues were immediately noticed by me, and as somebody who usually mains snipers in Borderlands 2, I chose not to use them in Borderlands 2 VR as the box pop-up to aim is a very weird and unimmersive mechanic. Furthermore, movement controls for Borderlands 2 VR were not ported to Steam with dual joysticks in mind, and I had Valve Index controllers at the time, so I had to install a user-created controller layout to even be able to move around and look around in the game. All of these issues that I've listed thus far, alongside many others, made it feel as if Borderlands 2 VR was actively fighting against you while trying to simply enjoy it, and most other users agreed, with the Steam reviews for Borderlands 2 VR being quite mixed and the player counts being incredibly low today. And without the dedicated modding fanbase of Skyrim VR, Borderlands 2 VR has almost been completely forgotten. Yet much like with Skyrim VR, Borderlands 2 VR is one of the most content-complete and longest overall VR packages, just because it's a VR port of a traditional flat-screen game. These two games, however, were not the only examples of sloppy VR ports. Hitman 3, now known as Hitman World of Assassination, got a PSVR port in early 2021. This game included all of the Hitman reboot series, Hitmans 1 through 3, and as such, much like the other two titles we've discussed in this chapter, became another one of the largest VR titles, simply as a port. The immersion of Hitman VR is simply fantastic, and it's something I finally got to experience on my HTC Vive at the time when it launched for PC VR players 1 year later in 2022. Yet, much like with Borderlands 2 VR, the game felt like it was a simple port with little to no mechanics added for the VR experience. This meant that, once again, there was no manual reloading, and controls were very janky, with some weird mechanics for aiming, and the game also just felt like it was fighting against you at times while just trying to simply enjoy it. You will constantly deal with crashes and broken physics while playing Hitman in VR, which is something that just completely pulls you out of the immersive experience, which, when everything works, is the highlight of Hitman VR, in my opinion. And much like with Skyrim VR and Borderlands 2 VR, Hitman VR was met with mixed reception due to the fact that the game felt like a basic port with next to nothing added to enhance the experience in the immersive medium that is virtual reality. However, there is one notable port that, unlike Skyrim, Borderlands 2, and Hitman VR, actually functions smoothly, and that is the port of No Man's Sky into virtual reality. In August of 2019, Hello Games launched the Beyond update for No Man's Sky. This update not only expanded multiplayer, but it also added virtual reality support for both PC VR and PlayStation VR users simultaneously. Much like other ports, No Man's Sky VR has the fundamental basics of a virtual reality game with VR controls, the ability to aim your multi-tool in any direction, and even physically grabbing the joysticks and throttle to pilot your starship. Menus and inventory screens appear as floating holograms, and you can interact with them using your hands. And base building becomes much more of a tactile process as you literally place and rotate items in the world around you. However, as previously mentioned, unlike many other VR ports of its time, No Man's Sky VR wasn't a stripped-down experience. It was the full game, with every planet, system, and update accessible fully in virtual reality. However, sales figures of Hitman VR and No Man's Sky VR are quite literally impossible to find, as they just both use the base game and launch VR tools into it to allow you to play in virtual reality. Yet this is not the case for Skyrim VR or Borderlands 2 VR, as those packages were each separate titles from the base game. And if you know anything about the history of both of those titles, both games were insanely popular when they initially released as flat-screen games. So, how did their VR ports hold up? Well, currently on SteamDB on September 4th, 2025 at 3:30 in the morning, Skyrim VR has 107 current players, with a peak 24-hour count of 227 and an all-time peak 7.5 years ago of 3,048 players. To put this into perspective, the initial launch of Skyrim 13.8 years ago had an all-time player count of 287,411, with 760 concurrent players at the time of recording. However, Borderlands 2 VR is faring substantially worse than Skyrim VR, with a concurrent player count of 5 players at the time of recording, a 24-hour peak of 9 players, and an all-time peak of 202. These numbers are jarring considering the fact that Borderlands 2, the flat-screen version at the time of recording, has a concurrent player count of 1,773, a 24-hour peak of 4,256, and an all-time peak of 124,678. However, these low numbers can be attributed both to the slow growth of VR and the fact that these ports were overall lackluster. So what does a game built from the ground up for virtual reality look like? And how well would that perform? Virtual reality is truly at its best when developers create an experience from the ground up exclusively for the medium. When almost everything you think is possible. Games where you can interact with the world, pick up items, manually reload firearms, and hold swords by physically holding the buttons on your controller's grip. Yet, for some odd reason, games that offer this level of immersion are few and far between in virtual reality, and one of my favorites is a game called Blade and Sorcery. In this game, you can physically grab items in the world, and your hands must be squeezing the controller's grip to be able to hold them. If you open your hands, just like in real life, the item will drop. This level of interactivity can allow you as the player to grab onto walls to climb, to grab onto rope to swing, grab a rock and toss it at an enemy, or even grab an enemy's limbs to prevent them from moving. Furthermore, since this game was designed with virtual reality controls in mind, unlike in Skyrim VR, the enemies react to attacks from all possible angles. If you raise your sword for a downward strike, an enemy will attempt to react in a way that makes sense, instead of standing there and taking it. In addition to this, you as the player can also dodge, parry, and counterattacks based on what you believe to be physically possible in the moment. If an enemy is shooting fireballs or arrows at you, you can lean out of the way to avoid impact, or the game even does a silly little thing where it slows down time so you can deflect an arrow with your sword, or even catch it and toss it back. Things like this are only possible in the medium of virtual reality, and this is where VR really does shine. Pavlov VR is another fantastic example of a truly immersive VR experience. During the last chapter, I mentioned a handful of VR FPS ports like Hitman or Borderlands 2 VR, and in those games, you cannot manually reload. However, you can in Pavlov, which unlike the aforementioned titles, is an FPS game built from the ground up to be playable in virtual reality. When in a gunfight in Pavlov, you need to understand how the weapon you're holding works. You need to know how to eject a mag, where to grab the new one, and how to put it in fast to rack the slide to get back in the fight. This adds room for human error and creates a skill gap to reloading, which just simply would not exist in a game like Call of Duty where all you have to do is press R to reload. Furthermore, Pavlov even allows players to grab magazines out of other players' guns, rendering them useless outside of the single round remaining in the chamber. And this level of interactivity is only really possible within the medium of virtual reality. Additionally, since Pavlov is a VR game, there isn't a minimap, meaning to find other players, you need to actually use your eyes and ears instead of little dots telling you exactly where someone is. And when you do manage to track down another player, it also needs to be understood that they can move their arms and body in almost any way, meaning a physically fit individual has more of a competitive edge over someone who is out of shape, as the more fit player could quickly lie prone or crouch, which is something you have to physically do in VR. However, if PvP isn't your speed, but you do want to shoot some guns in VR, there is a game called Hot Dogs, Horseshoes, and Hand Grenades, or H3VR, which is basically an in-depth VR shooting range. This game allows you to get close to some of the most iconic weapons from the most popular movies and games without the need for ear protection or thousands of dollars to drop on firearms and ammunition. And while H3VR doesn't reflect things like the feeling of recoil or the potential lethality of a mistake, it's just simply a good time to shoot some guns in VR. All three of these games, Blade and Sorcery, Pavlov VR, and H3VR are very fun, but there's one thing that they all have in common. They're not really story-driven titles. While Blade and Sorcery does have a new-ish mode called Crystal Hunt, there's not much of a story to any of these games. However, that is not the case with Half-Life Alyx. As I mentioned at the front of the video, well over an hour ago, Half-Life Alyx really is the king of virtual reality games, and it's time to talk about why. The major thing that sets Half-Life Alyx apart from its competition is how naturally it pulls you into its world. Unlike in most VR titles, where interactions are either not present or feel tacked on, here in Alyx, everything feels like it belongs. Just like in Pavlov VR, reloading your pistol is not just pressing a button, it's fumbling around for a new magazine while enemies are closing in. There's also all the little details that sell the world. The fact that you can interact with almost every object, pick up glass bottles and throw them on the ground to break them, write on a dry erase board or a window with a marker you just found and erase it realistically. All these little details that aren't necessary to the game, but just make the world feel like you're actually there, like it's real. And it's not just the interactivity that sells the game, it's also the atmosphere and the art style. Objects are rendered in a stylized but also extremely high definition way, making them look believable in the world in which they exist. And then there's the soundscape, the music, and the way every object makes a realistic noise. And all of this is just the atmosphere and the world building for Half-Life Alyx, not even the story or the gameplay. As previously stated, unlike most VR games that lean on simple mechanics, Alyx tells a story, a real one, with characters you care about and stakes that actually matter. You'll come to enjoy the radio chatter that Alyx has with Russell, and even the way Alyx expresses herself in different situations in the game. Furthermore, the gameplay in Half-Life Alyx is simple but fantastic, and the game even fixes a major problem I have with virtual reality titles. When you drop an item in Half-Life Alyx, you can use this little sling motion to teleport it back to your hand, rather than having to bend over to pick an item up, which is something I can't do at the moment due to medical complications. Additionally, the gunplay feels responsive but tense due to the limited ammo supply throughout levels. And Half-Life Alyx even has occasional puzzles scattered throughout the levels, which aren't too complicated but do make for a nice break in gameplay. Overall, when it all comes together, the interactivity, the world building, the atmosphere, the storytelling, and the gameplay, Half-Life Alyx stops feeling like a simple VR experience and just becomes an additional Half-Life game. This overall lack in compromise and fantastic world building is really what makes Half-Life Alyx the king of virtual reality titles. But how well did each of these games perform? Looking back at the last chapter, we know that sales figures for most VR ports like Borderlands 2 VR and Skyrim VR were not fantastic. So do true VR experiences fare any better? Looking at Blade and Sorcery, one of my personal favorite VR titles, the game currently has 814 players, a 24-hour peak of 843, and an all-time peak of 9,509. Pavlov VR is faring much worse at 158 current players, a 24-hour peak of 217, and an all-time peak of 3,221. Hot Dogs, Horseshoes, and Hand Grenades is currently sitting at 240 players with a 24-hour peak of 310 and an all-time peak of 992. Yet Half-Life Alyx currently has 441 players, a 24-hour peak of 458, and an all-time peak of 42,858. This popularity could be attributed to its ties with the Half-Life franchise and the fact that there hasn't been a new Half-Life game in a very, very long time. However, these numbers are extremely low for almost every single title. So why is that? As discussed earlier in the video, the Quest series is, without a question, the most successful line of VR headsets ever made. The Quest 2 sold over 20 million units and put VR into the hands of people who have never even considered buying a headset before. The main appeal of the Quest headsets is the fact that you don't need a gaming PC or a console to run them, they just run as standalone units. Unfortunately, however, this success has come at a cost. The hardware is just simply severely underpowered, and the largest install base of VR users don't have the hardware necessary to run the best VR games. But this is a massive issue because the Quest has the largest install base by far. They dictate the standard developers aim for. When your game has to run on a mobile grade processor from years ago, you're forced to cut corners everywhere. And since no studio wants to ignore the biggest audience, almost every major VR title ends up built around these Quest headsets' limitations. It's almost like if the entire gaming industry had to design around the PlayStation 2 in 2025, as that console's extremely well selling, but it would hold back the entire industry's development into future technologies, graphics, better gameplay, and much, much more. So even though we have the capability of creating high-end gaming PCs with beefy GPUs like the RTX 5090, and even headsets to pair them with, like the Valve Index or even the rumored upcoming Valve Deckard, most VR games will never take advantage of that additional power simply because they need to run on a Quest. And as a result, virtual reality as a whole just feels stuck in the past, which really sucks because unlike in the 90s, we have the technology to create groundbreaking next generation experiences, but instead, VR is just settling for low poly environments and simple mechanics. And even if VR does get a port of a popular game, the numbers just don't hold up. A flat screen title can sell millions of copies, but the VR port could sell a fraction of that. And these poor sales figures even carry over into virtual reality exclusive titles as well. Obviously, the install base is much smaller for VR games, but the player counts we've seen in nearly every title I've spoken about so far in the video pale in comparison to the overall sales of VR headsets. In fact, the majority of VR users aren't even buying most big releases. Instead, they're sticking to free social titles like VR Chat, or even evergreen hits like Beat Saber. Most people that I know personally that have VR headsets just keep them in the closet and only take them out on occasion, and I believe that most people who do own headsets either don't use them often or just simply use them for casual games, like mods for Minecraft in VR or the aforementioned Beat Saber and VR Chat. In fact, VR Chat is one of the only VR games that has seen growth year over year since its launch back in 2017. The Steam graphs show spikes in player counts every holiday season, which is probably due to new people getting VR headsets as gifts for Christmas, and the fact that the game is free to play. But the harsh reality for VR is that it just demands more from players. You can sit on a couch and play a flat screen game or at your desk for hours, but VR requires space, physical effort, and in some cases, a tolerance for motion sickness. Additionally, PC VR does just simply have a high barrier to entry, requiring both a headset and a capable gaming PC. So if you just had a long day at work, do you want to strap a headset to your face and stand up for even more time? Or would you rather just kick back on the couch and play some Helldivers 2 with the boys? And even if you choose to stand up for more hours and play some VR games, another issue is just the overall lack of quality VR experiences. Obviously, there are exceptions like Half-Life Alyx, Beat Saber, Boneworks, Blade and Sorcery, but these games are just few and far between. They have shown what VR could really do when developers lean into the medium instead of treating it like an experiment, but for every Half-Life Alyx, there are 100 half-baked ports, wave shooters, and shovelware titles that offer little more than novelty. Additionally, because of the slow adoption of VR, most studios are just hesitant to sink years of development into a VR exclusive game when the audience is just small, the Quest headsets are weak, and the payoff is just uncertain. And as a result, VR often gets watered down experiments or tech demos disguised as full games. One could argue that all of this is why virtual reality adoption is so slow. I've spoken about this in previous videos, but if there really aren't that many VR games that are worth playing, what's the point in getting a headset? And if there aren't that many consumers on VR as a platform, then what's the point in developing for it? And all of this just evolves into a constant cycle of but no games, but developers rebuttal with but no players. But then players say, but no games, and it just becomes a constant back and forth. And developers will have to be the ones to bite the bullet, because until we see a steady pipeline of big budget, high quality VR titles, VR will continue to feel like a side hobby rather than a pillar of the gaming industry. Yet, outside of a handful of brave attempts, the vast majority of AAA game developers treat VR as optional at best or irrelevant at worst. It's not that they don't see the potential of VR, it's just that the market hasn't proven to be profitable enough to justify the risk. The only companies that are consistently investing in VR are those with something to gain, or indie developers with a passion for the medium. But for studios like Capcom, Ubisoft, Activision, or Rockstar, VR is still just an afterthought, a platform for side modes or potential experiments rather than flagship projects. And until the industry breaks this cycle, VR will remain stuck on the sidelines. For a while, there was hope that the console market could break VR into the mainstream, especially when rumors were swirling around Xbox finally stepping into the VR space with a headset to rival Sony's PlayStation VR 2. But as we all know now, that headset was just a MetaQuest 3S with Xbox branding. No new hardware, no innovation, no exclusive ecosystem, just the same old underpowered tech in a new shell. When you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, it's not hard to see why VR feels like it's failing. It isn't because people don't want immersive experiences. Gamers have proven time and time again that they crave deeper, more engaging ways to play. The problem with VR is that as an ecosystem, it's trapped. Trapped by weak hardware, trapped by cautious studios, and trapped by shallow libraries and abandoned ports. Virtual reality is not failing because it can't deliver on its promise, but because the industry itself has tied itself down to the lowest common denominator. And unless that changes, unless somebody takes the risk to push VR forward, the medium risks fading into the background all over again, just like it did in the 90s. Thank you for watching this video. It is currently 5:30 in the morning on September 2nd, and I'm still deep in the trenches of working on this, but I just really wanted to say thank you. I have put a lot of time and effort into working on this video, and I'm really proud of how it's turning out so far. So if you enjoyed it, please let me know by leaving a like, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. And to everybody who already has subscribed to the channel, I really do want to say thank you for over 5,000 subscribers, over 2.5 million video views, and this video right here is going to be the 200th video here on Release Radar. And that's why I wanted to go all out. Normal content will resume after this video goes live, but I do think I'm going to continue to make video essays from here on out. So if you guys like this, if you have any honest critiques or just anything you want to let me know about this video, let me know down below in the comments. Like and subscribe. My name's Release Radar, and well, here's to another 200 videos. Thanks for watching. Peace.